My daughter-in-law's family locked my son in the freezing shed during a blizzard. They said it was just a joke. When I found him barely breathing, hypothermic, they laughed and told me to stop being dramatic. They drove away in their fancy SUV while I waited for the ambulance, but they didn't know my younger brother. As the paramedics loaded my son into the ambulance, I made one phone call. Just one. "They're heading back to Toronto now," I said quietly. "Do what you do best." Before we continue, if you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe to Velvet Vengeance and like this video. Write in the comments what province you're watching from. I'm always curious to know. Now, let me tell you how it all began. The air at the Morrison family cottage in Muskoka smelled of pine and wood smoke that December evening. To everyone else, it probably seemed like the perfect winter getaway. But I've learned to read the air differently over my 67 years. Beneath the pleasant scent of the fireplace, I caught something else, something bitter, something dangerous. I sat in an old rocking chair on the enclosed porch, watching through the frosted windows as my son, Daniel, helped his wife Vanessa's family unload groceries from their vehicles. 3 black Range Rovers lined up like a funeral procession in the snow-covered driveway. The Morrisons never did anything small. My son moved quickly, eager to please, carrying twice as many bags as anyone else. His laughter rang out too loud, too forced, whenever his father-in-law made one of his cutting remarks. I knew that laugh. It was the same laugh I used to hear from his mother when she was trying to smooth things over at difficult family gatherings. Daniel had inherited her gentle nature, her desperate need to keep everyone happy. It broke my heart to watch him. The Morrison cottage wasn't really a cottage at all. It was a massive cedar and glass monument to wealth, perched on a private peninsula that jutted into Lake Muskoka. Gerald Morrison had made his fortune in commercial real estate development, and he made sure everyone knew it. The cottage had 7 bedrooms, a home theater, and a wine cellar. Even the boathouse was bigger than the home I'd raised Daniel in back in Thunder Bay. I only came to these gatherings for my son. Every holiday, he would call me with that hopeful voice. "Dad, please come. Vanessa's family really wants to get to know you better. It would mean so much to me." What he meant was that he needed an ally, someone in his corner, someone who saw what was really happening behind the polished smiles and expensive wine. Gerald Morrison was holding court in the great room when I came inside. He was a big man, not tall but wide, with the kind of presence that filled a room and left no air for anyone else. His son, Bradley, stood beside him like a loyal lieutenant. They shared the same cold eyes, the same way of looking at people as if calculating their net worth. "Harold," Gerald's voice boomed across the room, "come join us for a drink. We're having the good scotch tonight." I walked over slowly. My bad knee always acted up in the cold weather. "Thank you, Gerald." "Don't mind if I do. Danny boy here was just telling us about his little promotion," Gerald continued, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "Assistant manager at the hardware store. Isn't that something?" The way he said it made the words sound small, pathetic. My son had worked at Morrison's Hardware for 8 years, had single-handedly turned the Thunder Bay location into the highest-performing store in the chain. But to Gerald, he would always be Danny boy, the working-class kid who had somehow convinced Vanessa to marry him. "Daniel's done excellent work," I said, keeping my voice steady. "That store's profits have doubled since he took over operations." Gerald waved his hand dismissively. "Numbers on a spreadsheet. Anyone can move numbers around. Real business is about vision, about taking risks." He looked at Daniel with something like pity. "Maybe someday you'll understand that, Danny." My son just nodded and smiled, but I saw his jaw tighten. I saw the way his hand trembled slightly as he lifted his drink. Vanessa appeared at Daniel's side, slipping her arm through his. For a moment, I thought she might defend him. Instead, she said, "Daddy's right, honey. You should think bigger. Maybe Bradley could mentor you." Bradley smirked. He was 34, same as Daniel, but the resemblance ended there. Where my son had earned everything through hard work and determination, Bradley had coasted through life on his father's money. He'd never held a real job, never faced a genuine challenge. His greatest accomplishment was marrying a woman whose family was even wealthier than his own. "Sure," Bradley said. I could teach you a few things about how business really works. If you can keep up. The laughter that followed was sharp, exclusive. I wasn't part of it, and neither was Daniel. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found my son sitting alone on the back deck, wrapped in a heavy coat, staring out at the frozen lake. The temperature had dropped to -20, and I could see his breath forming clouds in the moonlight. "You should come inside," I said, settling into the chair beside him. "You'll catch your death out here." Daniel didn't move. "Remember when I was a kid, and we used to go ice fishing on Lake Nipigon? Of course. You hated putting the worms on the hook." He laughed, but it was hollow. "Those were good times, simple times." "Daniel," I put my hand on his arm, "you don't have to stay with these people. You don't owe them anything. She's my wife, Dad, and you're my son. I see how they treat you. It's not right." He turned to look at me, and in the moonlight, I saw tears glistening in his eyes. She wasn't always like this. When we first met, when we were at university, she was different. She was kind. She believed in me. People change when money's involved. "She's pregnant, Dad." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat back in my chair, momentarily speechless. 3 months along, Daniel continued. "We were going to announce it tomorrow at the family dinner." I thought maybe this would change things. Maybe having a grandchild would make Gerald see me differently. I wanted to tell him that Gerald Morrison would never see him as anything but an inconvenience, that the baby would just become another pawn in their endless power games. But I couldn't. Not then. Not with that fragile hope still shining in my son's eyes. "Congratulations," I said instead. "I'm going to be a grandfather." He smiled, and for just a moment, he looked like the boy I remembered. The boy who used to believe that kindness and hard work would always be rewarded. The next morning brought trouble. I woke early, as I always do, and made my way to the kitchen to start the coffee. Through the window, I could see that the sky had turned an ominous gray. Weather reports had been warning about an incoming storm system, but Gerald had dismissed it. "We have generators," he'd said, "and enough supplies for a month. What's a little snow?" I found Daniel in the kitchen before me, looking at his phone with a worried expression. "Environment Canada just issued a severe blizzard warning," he said. "They're saying we could get over 60 centimeters by tonight. Winds up to 90 kilometers an hour. We should head back to the city." I suggested that. "Gerald says we're staying. He says only cowards run from weather." Of course he did. Men like Gerald Morrison don't flee from anything. They stand their ground and let other people deal with the consequences. By noon, the first flakes had started to fall. By 3 o'clock, you couldn't see the lake anymore. The wind howled around the cottage like something alive, something hungry. The Morrisons seemed unbothered. They sat in the great room, drinking wine and playing cards, while the storm raged outside. Gerald had started making jokes about Daniel's concern. "City boy's scared of a little snow," he said. "Maybe he should go wait in the shed until it's safe." Bradley laughed. "That's not a bad idea. Builds character." "Stop it," I said. "That's enough." Gerald's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me, Harold? Did you say something?" I said, "That's enough. Leave the boy alone." The room went quiet. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. Gerald set down his glass and stood up slowly. "I don't believe I asked for your opinion," he said. "You're a guest in my home. You'd do well to remember that. And Daniel is your son-in-law. He's family. You'd do well to remember that." We stared at each other across the room. Gerald was used to intimidating people with his money, his connections, but I'd spent 35 years teaching high school history in Thunder Bay. I'd faced down plenty of bullies in my time. Finally, Gerald smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "You're right, Harold. Family is important. In fact, why don't we have a little family bonding time? Bradley, take Danny out to the shed and show him where we keep the emergency generator. Make sure he knows how to operate it, just in case." Daniel stood up. "I can do that. I'll come with you," I said. "No need." Gerald's voice was firm. "Bradley will take care of it. You and I can have a nice chat about family values." I didn't like it. Something felt wrong. But Daniel was already pulling on his coat, following Bradley out the back door into the blinding white chaos of the storm. 20 minutes passed. 30. Gerald kept me occupied with meaningless conversation, refilling my drink, asking about my retirement plans. But I kept glancing at the door. "They're taking too long," I finally said. "Relax. They're probably having a good time out there. Male bonding. 45 minutes. An hour." I stood up. "I'm going to check on them." "Sit down, Harold. I'm going to check on my son." I pushed through the back door and was immediately hit by a wall of wind and snow. The cold was shocking, even through my heavy coat. I could barely see 3 feet in front of me, but I knew the general direction of the shed, and I started walking. It took me 10 minutes to find it. The shed was a substantial structure, built to house the backup generator, tools, and outdoor equipment. When I reached the door, I found it locked. From the outside, a heavy padlock had been placed through the hasp, the kind of padlock that wasn't there yesterday. I pounded on the door. "Daniel! Daniel! Can you hear me?" A faint voice came from inside, weak, trembling. "Dad? Dad, I'm in here. They locked me in. It's so cold." I pulled at the lock with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The shed wasn't heated. In this weather, with temperatures plunging below -30 with the wind chill, hypothermia could set in within an hour. "Hold on, son. I'm going to get you out." I stumbled back toward the cottage, fighting the wind every step. When I burst through the door, covered in snow, Gerald and Bradley were sitting calmly by the fire. Vanessa was there too, a strange, blank expression on her face. "Where's the key?" I demanded. Gerald raised an eyebrow. "Key to what?" "Don't play games with me. My son is locked in that shed. He's freezing. Give me the key." Bradley laughed. "It's just a joke, old man. He'll be fine. A little cold builds character. He could die out there." "Drama queen," Gerald said. "Just like his father. We'll let him out in a bit. Let him cool off. Literally." I looked at Vanessa. "Your husband is in danger. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Daddy knows what he's doing." I understood then. I understood everything. This wasn't a spontaneous prank. This was planned, calculated. They wanted to break my son, to remind him of his place. The pregnancy must have threatened them somehow. Maybe they were afraid Daniel would assert himself as the father of their grandchild. Maybe they just couldn't stand the thought of someone they considered beneath them being connected to their family forever. I pulled out my phone. No signal. The storm had knocked out the cell towers. "The landline," I said. "Where's the landline?" Gerald's smile widened. "Disconnected it yesterday. Didn't want any interruptions during our family time." I didn't waste any more words. I went to the garage, found a pair of bolt cutters, and fought my way back through the storm to the shed. When I finally got the door open, I found Daniel curled in a corner, barely conscious. His lips were blue. His breathing was shallow. I pulled off my coat and wrapped it around him, then half carried, half dragged him back to the cottage. The Morrisons watched in silence as I laid him on the couch by the fire. Only when I pulled out my satellite phone, the one I always carry when I travel to remote areas, did Gerald's expression change. 911. I need an ambulance. Life-threatening hypothermia. The emergency dispatcher told me it would be difficult to get anyone through the storm, but they would try. They told me to keep him warm, to monitor his breathing, to watch for signs of cardiac distress. I did everything they said. For 3 hours, I sat with my son, while the people who had tried to kill him watched from across the room. The ambulance finally arrived at midnight. The paramedics had to use snowmobiles for the last kilometer. They worked on Daniel for 20 minutes before loading him onto a stretcher. "He's going to make it," one of them told me. "You found him just in time. Another hour and we'd be telling a different story." As they carried him out, I heard Bradley mutter to his father, "This is ridiculous. It was just a prank." I stopped. I turned. I looked at Gerald Morrison, at his smug face, at the complete absence of remorse in his eyes. Then I pulled out my phone and made a call. "Robert," I said quietly, stepping away from the group. "It's Harold." Silence on the other end. Then my brother's voice, rough from sleep. "Harry, do you know what time it is?" "They tried to kill Daniel. The Morrisons. They locked him in a shed during a blizzard, left him to freeze." More silence. I could hear Robert breathing, could almost hear his mind working. "Where are they now?" Heading back to Toronto. Once the road's clear. I understand. Do what you do best. I hung up and climbed into the ambulance with my son. The drive to the hospital in Huntsville took over 2 hours in the storm conditions. I held Daniel's hand the whole way, watching the monitors, listening to his labored breathing. The paramedics had covered him with thermal blankets, but his body temperature was still dangerously low. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert. On it. You focus on Daniel. I hadn't spoken to my brother in 3 years. Not since he'd retired from the RCMP under circumstances that were never fully explained to the public. Robert had spent 32 years as an investigator, rising to head one of the most effective organized crime units in Canadian law enforcement history. He'd put away drug traffickers, money launderers, corrupt politicians, but somewhere along the way, his methods had become unconventional. The official story was that he'd burned out, took early retirement, moved to a cabin in rural Nova Scotia to fish and read books. The real story was different. Robert had uncovered evidence of a massive corruption network that extended into the highest levels of government. When he tried to bring it to light, he was shut down, forced out. They destroyed his career, his reputation, his marriage, but they couldn't destroy what he knew. And they couldn't destroy the network of contacts he'd built over 3 decades. My brother was a patient man. He'd been waiting for the right opportunity to use what he knew. I'd just given him one. Daniel was admitted to the ICU at Huntsville Hospital. The doctors said it was severe hypothermia, complicated by the stress on his heart. He needed at least a week of monitoring, but he would live. I sat in the hard plastic chair beside his bed and watched him sleep. His face was pale, but his breathing had steadied. The monitors beeped their reassuring rhythm. When he finally woke, late the next afternoon, his first words were, "The baby. Is the baby okay?" I'd forgotten. In the chaos, I'd completely forgotten about the pregnancy. "Vanessa should be checked," Daniel mumbled. "The stress. Please, Dad." I made the call. The nurse at the cottage told me that everyone had left that morning as soon as the roads were cleared. They hadn't asked about Daniel. They hadn't left any message. I didn't tell my son that. Not yet. "Everything's fine," I said. "You just focus on getting better." He closed his eyes, and I saw a tear slide down his cheek. The next 3 days passed slowly. I barely left Daniel's side. Nurses brought me coffee and sandwiches. The hospital chaplain stopped by to offer support. A social worker came to discuss what had happened. I gave a full statement to the OPP officers who arrived on the second day. "We'll be investigating," the lead officer said. "But I have to warn you, cases like this can be complicated. The Morrisons have significant legal resources." I understand. What I didn't tell them was that I had resources too. On the 4th day, my phone rang. An unknown number. Harry. Robert's voice was calm, controlled. "You should turn on the news." I found a television in the waiting room and switched to CBC News Network. The anchor was in the middle of a breaking story. Developing news this hour. Toronto real estate magnate Gerald Morrison and his son, Bradley Morrison, have been arrested in connection with allegations of fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. Sources say the investigation stems from financial irregularities in Morrison Development Corporation dating back over 15 years. I sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs. Gerald Morrison built his real estate empire in the late 1992s and early 2000s, the anchor continued. But questions have long surrounded the source of his initial capital and his connections to several offshore investment funds. Tonight, those questions may finally have answers. The screen showed footage of Gerald being led out of his Toronto mansion in handcuffs. His face was a mask of fury and disbelief. Behind him, Bradley was being escorted to a separate vehicle, looking like a frightened child. My phone buzzed. A text from Robert. "That's just the beginning. Call me when you can talk privately." I found a quiet corner of the hospital and called my brother. "How did you do this so quickly?" I asked. Robert laughed. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years. "I didn't do anything, Harry. I just made a few phone calls, reminded some people of information they'd rather stayed buried, pointed some journalists in the right direction." "What did you find?" Gerald Morrison didn't build his fortune through hard work and vision. He built it by laundering money for some very unpleasant people. Russian oligarchs, mostly, looking to move their assets into Canadian real estate. He's been doing it for 2 decades. And nobody knew? Oh, people knew. People in high places. But Morrison was useful to them. He made them money, kept them connected to foreign investors. As long as he was valuable, he was protected. Robert paused. But protected people can become inconvenient when their secrets start to surface. When certain documents start circulating to certain journalists. When former RCMP investigators start asking questions. He'll get lawyers, the best lawyers. He will. And those lawyers will discover that the evidence against him is overwhelming. Documents, wire transfers, testimony from former associates who've decided to cooperate with authorities in exchange for immunity. Another pause. I told you, Harry. I've been waiting a long time for the right opportunity. This wasn't about Daniel, was it? Not entirely. It was about Daniel. Your son gave me the excuse I needed. The Morrison family crossed a line when they hurt him. They made it personal. And personal is always the best motivation. I thought about my brother's life. The years he'd spent fighting corruption, only to be crushed by the very system he'd sworn to serve. The isolation, the bitterness, the endless waiting. Thank you, Robert. Don't thank me yet. There's more coming. The next week brought revelation after revelation. Each day, new details emerged about the Morrison empire. Journalists who'd been investigating Gerald for years suddenly found their sources willing to talk. Financial records that had been sealed were mysteriously leaked. Former employees came forward with stories of intimidation, harassment, and fraud. Bradley Morrison, it turned out, wasn't just riding on his father's coattails. He'd been actively involved in the money laundering operation, using his party lifestyle as cover for meetings with foreign investors. Several women came forward with allegations of assault that had been buried through payoffs and legal threats. Vanessa Morrison filed for divorce within days of her father's arrest, not out of solidarity with Daniel, but to protect her own assets. The divorce papers, which somehow became public, revealed the extent of the family's contempt for my son. Internal emails showed they had been planning to push Daniel out of the family business entirely, to minimize his role in their grandchild's life, to eventually replace him with someone more suitable. One email from Gerald to Vanessa was particularly devastating. The problem with your husband is that he doesn't understand his place. He needs to be reminded that he exists at our pleasure. The shed incident should help with that. The shed incident. They had planned it in advance. Daniel was released from the hospital on the 7th day. I drove him back to Thunder Bay, to my small house on the edge of town. He didn't speak much during the trip, just stared out the window at the snow-covered landscape rolling by. When we pulled into my driveway, he finally said, "I saw the emails, Dad. I know. She never loved me. None of them did. I'm sorry, son." He turned to look at me. "Did you do this? The investigation? The arrests?" I thought carefully before answering. "I made a phone call to Uncle Robert." "What did you tell him?" "I told him what they did to you, and I told him to do what he does best." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Good." We went inside. I made tea and built a fire in the old wood stove. Daniel sat in the armchair by the window, the same chair his mother used to sit in when she was alive, and he didn't move for hours. The next few weeks were hard. Daniel barely ate, barely spoke. He went through the legal motions, cooperating with police, meeting with lawyers about the divorce. Vanessa's lawyers had initially tried to claim sole custody of the unborn child, citing Daniel's unstable mental state. But when the family's crimes became public, that strategy collapsed. The divorce was finalized in February. Daniel received full custody of the baby once it was born. Vanessa didn't contest it. She was too busy trying to distance herself from her family's disgrace. Gerald Morrison was denied bail. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His former associates, the ones he'd thought were loyal, were lining up to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. His empire, built on corruption and cruelty, was crumbling. Bradley Morrison attempted to flee the country. He was arrested at the Vancouver airport, trying to board a flight to Dubai. The charges against him had expanded to include sexual assault, based on testimony from multiple women who had been afraid to speak while the family was powerful. I watched these developments with a strange, detached calm. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel satisfied. I simply felt that order was being restored. That justice, delayed for so many years, was finally being served. One afternoon in March, I was organizing my garage when I heard a car pull into the driveway. It was Daniel. He got out slowly, carefully. Vanessa had given birth 2 weeks earlier, and Daniel had been in Toronto for the custody transfer. In his arms was a small bundle wrapped in a yellow blanket. "Dad," he said, "I'd like you to meet your granddaughter, Emma." I walked over and looked down at the tiny face. She had Daniel's eyes, kind eyes, gentle eyes. "Hello, Emma," I said softly. "Welcome to the family." We went inside. Daniel put Emma in the old bassinet that had once held him, the same bassinet my wife and I had used when he was born. I made tea while Daniel sat by the fire, watching his daughter sleep. "I've been thinking," Daniel said finally, "about what happened, about all of it. And I'm not angry at you, Dad, for calling Uncle Robert, for everything that happened to the Morrisons. I didn't know it would go this far," I admitted. "I just wanted them to face consequences. They deserved it, all of it. They would have killed me that night, left me to freeze because they thought it was funny, because they wanted to remind me of my place." He paused. "But that's not what I've been thinking about." "What then?" "I've been thinking about why I stayed so long, why I let them treat me that way, why I kept trying to earn their approval when it was never going to come. I waited. I think I was afraid," Daniel continued. "Afraid that if I stood up for myself, I'd lose everything. Vanessa, the job, the family. I thought I needed them." He looked at me, but I didn't. I just needed to remember who I was, where I came from. "You came from Thunder Bay," I said. "From a family that didn't have much money but had plenty of love. From a mother who taught you to be kind, and a father who taught you to work hard." I forgot that. Somewhere along the way, I forgot. It's easy to forget when people are constantly telling you that you're not good enough. Daniel stood and walked to the window. The spring sun was starting to melt the snow, and I could hear water dripping from the eaves. "I want to come back," he said. "Back to Thunder Bay. Back to the store, if they'll have me. I want Emma to grow up here, where I grew up. I want her to know her grandfather. The store would be lucky to have you back. And so would I." He turned to look at me. "What about Uncle Robert? Will he be okay? Your uncle has been taking care of himself for a long time. The people he exposed, they're too busy trying to save themselves to worry about him. The news said the investigation is expanding, that there might be charges against government officials. Your uncle had a lot of information stored up, a lifetime's worth. The Morrisons just gave him the opportunity to use it. All because they locked me in a shed. All because they thought they could hurt someone I love without consequences." Emma stirred in her bassinet, making small noises. Daniel went to her immediately, lifting her with the practiced ease of a new father. He held her against his chest, swaying gently. "I'm going to be different," he said. "I'm going to teach her that she doesn't need anyone's approval, that she's enough, just as she is. That's all any of us can do. Love our children and hope they learn the right lessons." Daniel smiled. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. "Thanks, Dad, for everything. I didn't do anything special. I just made a phone call. You saved my life. And then you made sure the people who tried to take it couldn't hurt anyone else ever again." I thought about Gerald Morrison, sitting in a cell, watching his empire collapse. I thought about Bradley, facing decades in prison. I thought about all the people they had hurt over the years, the lives they had destroyed, the crimes they had committed with impunity. And I thought about my brother Robert, alone in his cabin, finally seeing the work of 30 years come to fruition. "Justice isn't revenge," I said. "It's just setting things right." 6 months later, I stood on the shore of Lake Nipigon, holding my granddaughter in my arms. The water was calm, reflecting the golden light of a September evening. Daniel was setting up our fishing equipment nearby. "You know, Emma," I said softly, "your father used to hate fishing when he was young. Couldn't stand putting worms on the hooks. I heard that, Daniel called. And for the record, I still don't like the worm part. I laughed. Some things never change. We fished until the sun went down, not catching much, not caring. Emma slept peacefully in her carrier, oblivious to the water, the trees, the quiet conversation between her father and grandfather. On the drive home, Daniel asked, "Have you talked to Uncle Robert lately?" "Last week. He's doing well. Says the fishing in Nova Scotia isn't as good as Lake Nipigon, but he's managing. Is he ever going to come visit? Maybe. When things settle down completely, there are still a lot of trials pending." The Morrison case had expanded beyond anything any of us had anticipated. Gerald's cooperation with Russian money launderers had opened up connections to organized crime, corruption in provincial government, and financial fraud across multiple countries. The investigation was now being handled by joint Canadian-American task forces. Gerald Morrison would spend the rest of his life in prison. Bradley would be eligible for parole in 15 years. The family's assets had been seized, their name destroyed. Vanessa had tried to reach out to Daniel once, a few months after the divorce. She wanted to discuss co-parenting arrangements. Daniel had declined. The custody agreement was clear, and he had no interest in exposing Emma to someone who had stood by while her father nearly froze to death. "Do you think they ever think about that night?" Daniel asked. "About what they did? Probably, but not with remorse. Men like Gerald Morrison don't feel remorse. They only feel anger at being caught." "How do you know?" "Because I've seen it before. In students, in parents, in the petty tyrants who think their money or position puts them above consequences. They never learn. They only resent." We drove in silence for a while. Emma stirred in her car seat, making small sounds. "I think I understand now," Daniel said, "why you always told me that character matters more than success. Why you never let me take shortcuts, even when other kids' parents did. Your mother and I wanted you to be a good man. Not a successful man necessarily, just a good one. I hope I can do the same for Emma." "You will. I've never doubted that." We pulled into my driveway as the stars were coming out. The house was small, modest, nothing like the Morrison cottage, but it was warm and full of books and memories of a good life lived honestly. Daniel carried Emma inside while I gathered our fishing gear. As I walked up the path, I stopped for a moment and looked up at the night sky. The northern lights were starting to appear, ribbons of green and purple dancing across the darkness. I thought about my wife, gone now for 8 years. I thought about the choices I'd made, the family I'd built, the grandson I'd nearly lost. I thought about Robert, patient and relentless, waiting decades for the right moment to strike. And I thought about Gerald Morrison, stripped of his power, his money, his freedom, finally facing the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I just felt that, for once, the world had worked the way it was supposed to. Inside, Daniel was warming a bottle for Emma. I went to my study and sat in my old leather chair, surrounded by the books I'd collected over a lifetime of teaching. History books, mostly. Stories of empires rising and falling, of tyrants brought low by their own arrogance, of ordinary people who refused to be silent when silence was easier. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "Saw the northern lights from my porch tonight. Made me think of the old days. Stay well, brother." I typed back, "You too. Emma's getting big. You should come meet her." A minute later, "Soon, I promise." I put the phone down and picked up a book. It was a collection of essays about justice and memory, about how societies reckon with the crimes of the powerful. Outside, the northern lights continued their silent dance. Inside, I could hear Daniel singing softly to Emma, an old lullaby that his mother used to sing to him. This was my life now. Not the one I'd planned, not the one I'd expected, but a good life nonetheless. A life of small moments and quiet love. A life where the people who hurt my family had been brought to account, where my son was healing, where my granddaughter would grow up knowing she was cherished. Justice isn't about vengeance. It's about restoration, about putting things back the way they should be, about reminding the powerful that they are not above consequences, no matter how much money they have or how many connections they think they've bought. The Morrisons thought they were untouchable. They thought a retired teacher from Thunder Bay and his journalist brother were beneath their notice. They thought they could lock a man in a freezing shed and laugh about it over expensive scotch. They were wrong. And that's the story of how I made one phone call that brought down an empire. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted my son to know that his father would always protect him. Always. This concludes the story of a father's love and a brother's patience. Sometimes justice comes not through courts and lawyers, but through a single moment of connection between people who refuse to stay silent. What do you think? Did Harold make the right choice? Should he have trusted the system that had failed so many times before? Or was his action the only possible response to people who thought their wealth made them invincible? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? What would you have done in Harold's position? If this story moved you, please subscribe to Velvet Vengeance and like this video. Your support helps us continue creating stories about ordinary people who find extraordinary strength when their families are threatened. Until next time, stay warm and look out for each other. Because at the end of the day, family is all that truly matters.